Joanne, thank you so much for joining. You don't know what my first question is going to be, which will make this even more fun. Um, because I do not want to ask a specific question yet, we will definitely get into crafting your pitch, which I want to talk about as a whole. But I want to start with how do you apply this for perfectionists or people who are a little unsure or don't know exactly where to start? Where should people start with a pitch?
With it, oh, where they should start? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to start with your research. You have to really know what it is that you're going to pitch. And I think that is a problem that happens sometimes that people forget. Well, what exactly am I pitching here? And we're at this point where we have so much information and so much data that people feel more comfortable with that than they do with, gee, what am I pitching and how am I going to tell this in a story form so that people pay attention and that they're engaged?
Yeah, I mean, and pitches are universal. Really, I mean, obviously I work in PR, so that's a daily thing. But
Mm-hmm.
for almost anyone at any point at some juncture in your career, you're going to use a pitch.
That's right.
And so it's very easy to start to try and go through a process. I don't. I would say most people don't have a framework. Would you say that's
No,
fair?
no, they don't have a framework. One of the reasons that I wrote this book, and first of all, my background has been on the ad sales side of the media business. So I spent 25 years working for radio stations and television stations. And basically that's what I did. I pitched for a living. And you kind of, when you're doing that all the time, you do often forget what it is that you're doing because it becomes muscle memory. So then suddenly I'm at NYU and I'm teaching this real world class where we actually work with a real client. And the students get an ask and they are divided into teams where they compete against each other to see who comes up with the best idea and pitches it the best. And that's when I was like, wow, okay, I have to think through all these steps. But I also saw how uncomfortable my students were. And they're graduate students. So they're not 19 years old. And it shouldn't have really surprised me because I know a lot of senior people who still don't know how to pitch. And I think that in today's world, we're so inundated with so much noise that if we really don't understand what that framework is and how we're going to hook someone in to get them to even pay attention to us, they're not going to because there's just too much coming at us. So you really have to go back to that basic story, which I'm sure that you've used as well. It's like, okay, what am I going to say here that's going to make anybody pay attention? And then what comes after that?
Well, it's for the person who watches the last 10 minutes of Law and Order, right? Who wants to try and craft a really, really good narrative and try and tell a story. I took the LSAT and then I realized it's mostly paperwork. So I don't go that direction. But I did like, I think that's what I was drawn to my career is I did like the crafting argument, crafting something,
Mm-hmm.
going in, research can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. For me, what that means is knowing your audience, knowing what they're most likely to want to not only want to hear, but also want to act upon and what will eventually get them to want to go forward. So for me, it's not so much researching what I'm doing as much as I'm researching what they're doing.
It's both.
Because you don't
I
want to
think it's
go in,
both.
right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to go in with an idea they've already heard or an idea that hasn't worked yet.
Well, yes, I mean, we could go down, that's a whole different path to go down, but I don't believe that there are any really great new ideas. I think they're
Oh,
just the
it's
ideas that we have it's a fresh look at it. It's okay,
yeah.
this is, this, it's kind of goes back to there's no new stories. It's just the same story being told in a different way. And how are we going to do that? And I agree with you. You need to know who you're pitching to, but you also so that's part of your research. And part of it is okay. We have this idea. Why is this a good idea? That's where you need the data. And how am I going to unfold this so that people think that it's a good idea and they see that I'm not just making it up because
Mm-hmm.
in case you hadn't noticed, a lot of people just like to make things up these days, including ChatGPT, who likes to hallucinate. So I call that lying, but people call it hallucinating. That's the technical term for it.
Good to know if we have a technical term. But yeah, I am interested in unpacking the no new ideas because I agree there are
Okay.
no new ideas. There are new applications.
Exactly.
I shamelessly look to other industries or other areas where things have worked and see
Hmm.
if there's direct application.
Oh, I don't think that's shamelessly at all. I think that's really smart, because sometimes that's another thing that happens too. I think when you're in business in general, is that people get so pigeonholed into what their own industry is that they don't think, well, wait a second, they're doing that and it's successful. How could that be applicable to what we're doing? Where can we take bits and pieces of those things in there?
When did you first know you had a book?
I didn't. This one. I have written books before. This one happened very organically, and again, it goes back to, and I credit my students, and I credit the assistant dean. I'll give a shout out to Dave Hollander, who's the one who recruited me to teach in this program when it first started. But as I was trying to figure out, how am I going to teach this now? And again, sometimes I think it's harder to teach when you know something so well,
Oh, I'd agree with that.
because you have to, okay, what am I doing here? How am I going to break this down so that they can follow it? But I didn't want to create something that was a template, because I don't like templates. I think that they destroy creativity. That's why I call this a framework, very constraining. And the first thing I did was create a checklist, to kind of walk them through so that there was a flow and they kind of knew where the pieces needed to go. And it seemed to be working. And one day I remember so distinctly, in one of my classes, one of my students came up to me and she said, "Oh my God, this is gold. This is helping me, not just in here, it's helping me in all of my classes with all of my pitches." And I said, I keep thinking I should like elaborate on it, and maybe there's a book here. And she's like, "Yes, absolutely. It's what you have to do." So that's kind of how it happened organically. And one of the things that was really helpful in this particular book is that, often I don't know if you've written any, or you said you're in PR, so obviously you're right, but
Too much.
um, but any good writer knows that you need outside eyes, right? You can't just look at it from that. And before we even got to the place where we had a professional editor involved, I beta tested these on my students. So my students were getting PDF copies and telling me what they liked and what they didn't like. In fact, the title came out of a student. No one liked my title because they said it was too long and blah, 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 blah. And it was one of my students who came up with, he goes, "I like crafting your pitch. I think that's kind of how it happened." So yes, so there was a lot of, so it was a process that I thought was never going to end at one point. I'm like, okay, this is enough, because it's not a big book, and I didn't want it to be a big book. I didn't want it to be a lot of gobbledygook, so to speak, just to fill up pages. I wanted it to be practical, and it does involve also the things that you need once you know what that pitch is to really come across as an effective presenter. Because I personally think that learning to present, I think everything's a pitch, so I use those words interchangeably, but I think it's probably one of the single most important business skills out there, no matter whether you do it for a living as you do
Yeah.
or whether you are a leader and you have to present your ideas to the people who work for you, and pitching yourself. We're always pitching ourselves, whether
And
it's for a
that's
job or these days it's on social media, for God's sakes.
or sometimes it's like we live in a historic district, so if we want to do something to our house, that's a pitch.
That's right.
I have noticed that that muscle and that transferable skill, I get asked to do things a lot in the outside world that are not my job, because I'm like, well, this is just so inherently what I do that I don't think twice behind it. But one of the things is it's like 130 pages, the book.
Yes.
So I mean, that is in itself in line with crafting your pitch, because
Hmm.
obviously you wouldn't write a 500-page book about that. You could,
No.
but it's probably not in line with, if you're trying to get people to want to read it and want to engage with it, that's intentional.
Well, I just, as we're recording this, I just finished up a semester, and I got this from more than one student who said, "Okay, I finally get the importance of what I call the one sentence rule. That if you can't state your idea and your pitch in one sentence, when you get to it, then you don't really have it, because no one's going to understand it." And we don't understand that conciseness part of it, and that again, which goes back to why the book is short. It's to the point.
I think being concise is still undervalued.
I do too.
Because I think when we lack confidence, we can start to add more layers and add more things to something because almost, and I'm not saying this is a universality, but I believe that when I'm hearing somebody throw a lot of things into a word soup, I am seeing the projection of a lack of confidence in either themselves or the idea, and that's felt.
And I can't, the quote is escaping me correctly right now, but it's in my book, and it's a quote from the authors of Smart Brevity, where apparently the people at Axios have some sign in their office that says something to the tune of brevity is confidence. And I forget what the other word is that they use is fear. But I agree with you 100%. If you can't state it concisely, then you really don't understand it. That doesn't mean you're not going to elaborate. There aren't parts, there aren't details in there, but you've been out there. If someone doesn't like your idea, all the details and the financial aspect of it, nobody's going to care because they didn't like the idea.
Now, the other thing to not scare people with is that just be a volume shooter. When it comes to pitches, you are not going to get all of them
Mm-hmm.
right. You are not,
That's right.
and a lot of them are not like this is a permission structure. So so I don't want to go too far in it, but obviously it's not completely under your control. Some things are under your control, but the end decision isn't fully under your control. So you have to assess.
Did you read my whole book, Jeff? Because there's so much that you're saying that's in there. Thank you.
But that, yes, because, well, it's 130 pages. One of the things that you were saying is like, oh, you're a PR person, you're right. I'm like, this is why I like PR people don't write books, because we're writing a whole book a month just in content and things that we're coming out with and crafting very compacted things. Although, ironically, and I want to get this in the second half of the pod, I don't pitch. And I want to talk more about that in a second.
Okay.
But I don't know if there is a, how do I want to put this? There are times when I am pitching something and I know it's going wrong. And I'm kind of fine. I just reached this bliss or this point where I'm like, this didn't go right. I'm going to learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been in one of those?
Yes. And I think you learn. Look, the fact of the matter is that we don't win everything. Again, I'm old, so I was not raised in a world that gave me a trophy just for showing up. But we have a generation out there that was like that. It didn't matter what they did. Even if they lost, they got a trophy for it. And that's really not how the world works. So you have to get used to the fact that you're not going to get everything. So one of the things that I talk about in my book, which is really, something that my mother instilled in me, was to be your best. As long as you feel you've given it whatever the absolute best that you can be, then that's a win. And if you didn't win, well, I wonder why. What could I do better? What did they do that was better? And sometimes it's just things that come out of nowhere. You don't know what happens that morning when you're in front of someone that all of a sudden something shifted and changed that said, oh, that idea is better than this now because I just got some new directive. There are so many things that are out of our control.
I think I'm the product of, I don't get to where I am, or I don't get to a place of calm slash nihilism where I've been told no thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Bob Sutton, Huggy Rowe, I just interviewed recently, and they talked to me about friction. But one of the conversations there was about how many times successful people get told no, how many times they fail. And one of the general assertions in there is that most successful people don't succeed at a higher percentage. They just try more things. They try more.
Exactly.
I've been big on perfectionism is something that kind of holds people back.
As a perfectionist, I live with that. I still live with that. And I'm better at than I used to be. But perfectionism can hold you back because it's like, if it's just not right, I'm not going to go and submit it, or I'm not going to do it. It kind of goes back to Seth Godin, I believe, who says, ship before you're ready. Just, get it out there and see what happens. And that's the good thing about the world that we live in today, is that things are moving so quickly. Finding something good about it, because I think the world's pretty nuts right now, but that things move so quickly that we can then learn from it and we can course correct.
It's kind of like, is the world more nuts, or do we just have more information?
Yes.
Yes is the answer to the question.
I think about that a lot, actually. I think it's a really good point that you bring up, because I think to myself, my mom, she lived till 2 weeks shy of 98. So she lived a good long life. And she died in October of 2020, not from COVID, but she couldn't, it was just too much what was going on in the world. And when everything started to happen during COVID, she's like, oh my God, this is worse than it was during World War II. And she really went down this rabbit hole. And I had this conversation. I said, Mom, I don't know if it was worse, but you were not consumed all day long. You didn't have a television set. You didn't even have a radio, for God's sakes. You went to, well, they might have had a radio, and they were pretty poor, but you would go to the movies, apparently, to watch the newsreels to catch up on what was going on. So you weren't inundated with all the terrible things that were happening. You weren't getting, a clip of the shooting that was going on in Italy or France or wherever it was happening. So I think it's a little bit of both, but I do think things are a little bit nuts. I think social media has a lot to do with it. That's part of it. Is we could go off on no tangent on that, because I also teach social media, so I know more than your average person about these algorithms. And it's inflaming us, and it's dividing us, instead of the original concept was to bring us together.
It took me a long time to pull back that dopamine rush as a
Oh.
former creator slash kind of current creator. I don't know what to call myself, but but that is, yes. Once you realize what it is, it helps you kind of navigate it better. Although I don't think
Mm-hmm.
we're all flawed in that we all have echo chambers. We all have
Mm-hmm.
things that are easier for other people to see than they are for us to see, and it's hard to unblind that. But I also am a realist and know, like, you can't really um, pull that back. Once we're there, we're there. So then it's just trying to find ways to adjust to it. But yes, yes. In the attention economy, people are constantly doing things to
Mm-hmm.
make sure they hold your attention, and you have to do things to make sure you get that back.
Yes, and rage is one of them. It's, but it is. There's actually, there's a book that was 2013. I think he wrote it. Jonah Berger wrote a book called Contagiousness, and he talks about the emotion level of it, and it's the things that really make us angry. He didn't use the word rage at that time, but that's kind of where it's things that really, really make us happy. That will also be there, but the stuff in between, like I'm just this, doesn't really attract us, which is part of the reason why we can't get a level form of news coverage. It's either making us crazy or making us happy. My hands are going here. I always forget
Well,
them getting videotaped.
I was gonna make a point like 15 minutes ago, which is funny because when you're talking about pitches, and I want to get back to a topic in a second, but when you're talking about pitches, I have come in and stepped in for execs before who know the material better, but they just don't know what to do with their hands, and they don't know how to express the idea. So yes, it exists at all levels. That
Mm-hmm.
there might be a certain part of the pitch that we are all definitely bad at.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's the research, whether it's the details, whether it's the actual just rote execution of talking to people about it and selling the idea, somewhere we're bad. One thing I wanted, because of radio, I thought there's a similarity between radio and social media, which is that commonly, and I have a background there too, not as deep as yours, but it was, you either want to be loved or hated on air. The in
Mm-hmm.
between gets you nowhere. And I think that's a lot of where we're at, both with social media and media content in general, is that yes, bland, benign content had a window, had a window. It was like I remember just small businesses on Facebook early on were like, well, we got to post something. We have snacks in the break room. I'm like, okay, all right, well, it's not really core to the idea of brand awareness, aka sales. I would, by the way, just total aside, but I always am fascinated by when people come to me like, we want brand awareness. I'm like, sales. Like, no, we definitely want brand awareness. I'm like, okay, sales. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, at some point you're going to say sales or growth of company. It can't just be. There are different inroads and ways to do it, but yes, at some
Mhm.
point, let's just boil it down to sales.
Well, it's such a great point that you bring up because especially the book was written for marketing pitches, or it could be for anything. But everyone, how are we going to measure? Okay, well, we have more things to measure now than we've ever had before because we have all this data. But I always say, what's the most important KPI? How's your business doing? Are we making more money than we were before? Because if we're doing that, that is ultimately the best KPI. Yes, it's wonderful that I got all these likes on Facebook, or the people are talking about us, but are they buying what we're selling? That really is what we're in the business of. And I think people lose sight of that again, because we start everyone talks about data driven. And I personally hate that term. I prefer data informed, because data
Yeah.
driven, to me, it's all semantics. It's my little thing, and people will argue. Feel free to argue with me. Data's driving the train, and it shouldn't be driving the train. It should be informing what direction we're there. We still need to use our brains in here.
Well, it's bias in, bias out.
Mm-hmm.
Data driven, right?
Exactly.
So now, I mean, there's bias in everything, and there you know I think the inverse, and someone would argue, is if you involve the human, you involve human error. But I definitely believe that there is nuance and there is skill in somebody taking that data, as you say, data informed, is taking that data and being able to uh, blend that, put that through a filter, and figure out how to make that applicable.
Yeah, I agree.
I was going to say the word manipulate, but we don't use that in PR.
But we are being, that goes back to what social media is doing, is that the algorithms are being manipulated. And we've got I don't want to get into all the craziness that's happening right now as we're recording this with all of these college protests, but nobody's really talking about how it's being organized on social media, and whoever's behind it is manipulating those algorithms to get their message to who they want them to. And that's just a fact. And then as brands, we have to say, okay, well, how is that? Are we manipulating them, or
Ah,
do we have to be aware of people that are trying to even backlash against us? It's a really, it's just not as simple a business as it once was. And there's pluses and minuses on that part. But
yeah, not to spend too much time on it, but you opened the door and I wanted to hit the manipulation needs a half truth.
mm-hmm.
A good example would be summer of 2016, and there will be two Facebook groups in Idaho, one for pro-gun, one anti-gun,
Right.
and that's created by a Russian troll farm, and but they can't create that. They can't manipulate that unless there is some kind of half truth there, where there are people who believe the idea.
Right.
There's an interesting
Exactly.
nuance, right, in social media where they have to know you to be able to manipulate you. But once
Mm-hmm.
they do know you, then yes, yeah. Like if you get an ad for something, you said something near Alexa. If you, that's true.
Yeah.
If you wonder why you always have a notification, even if you just checked that app like 30 seconds ago, huh? That happens again. It's just I don't feel like it's nefarious as much as I'm like it's just something that's we have to adapt to.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's, look, what I've been in the business of marketing most of my adult life. It's the business of persuasion. Okay, I get that. It's, you're talking again semantics. There's a fine line between persuading and manipulating.
Absolutely. I think we also catch on to tactics, right?
Mm-hmm.
The infomercial worked until it didn't.
Right.
Certain tactics will work until they don't. People catch on, they get smarter, they get wiser. Although one of the interesting things for millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, like there are things where we are considered as a whole to be more tech savvy, to be less prone to scams. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of data that
Not
proves not true.
not true. It's really not true, because I teach. I've been teaching millennials and I teach Gen Z now, and some of this stuff, especially if I'm teaching the class in social media, where we use a book written by Sinan Arel on the hype, called The Hype Machine, and their eyes are like wide open, like, wow, I didn't realize that. So yes, in terms of actually using the media, I agree. But I can't take pictures like my students. I don't even want to. But there are people my age who know what to do with that stuff. So
My dad was a photographer, so every time I say I did something on Instagram, he just like just lets out
it.
a sigh.
That's how I fed you. That's how I fed you.
One of the, call me crazy, but one of the things I will look at things that are even inherently awful, and I'll be like, "Oh, I've learned something on the pitch." So scams are, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, a pitch. And one of the things I've watched documentary content about um, certain scams, especially the ones where somebody will just text you from a random number and it's something
Mm-hmm.
unrelated, and then they start up a conversation with you, which again, the half truth in this is that they appeal to people's loneliness because everybody's
They
a little
do.
bit more
Mm-hmm.
lonely. And so the pitch is getting the conversation. And again, you might be like, Jeff, you're crazy to think that a scam is a pitch, but I'm like, no, you can certainly learn things, not good things, but you can take
Mm-hmm.
good lessons from anything out there that
Well,
you
it's
can
scam. A
apply.
scam. They are pitching you something. It's a
Yeah.
scam. It's not a legitimate business that somebody has. They're trying and they're preying on vulnerabilities. And you're right. I think one of the big vulnerabilities right now is loneliness. The joke is that we're connected more than ever, and yet we're not talking to each other. And again, we could go down a different rabbit hole on that one. But I do think the pandemic has exasperated that because our phones and our technology was such a lifeline that now people walk down the street and they don't even look to see who's next to them. They're
They should if
so
they're in New York.
there's
They should
they
definitely
well
look to
that's
see.
what I say it all. I say it's public service announcement because you don't if I had both my AirPods in and I'm walking down the street, I'm in my own little world
Mm-hmm.
listening to your podcast, Jeff. But I'm in my but then you don't notice who's next to you. I was born and raised in New York, so I learned how to ride the subway when I was a kid and look out for the creeps. So again, but I do think that it's made people feel like their primary relationship is with their phone, um, and that also inhibits people from learning how to pitch because they think that they don't have those personal skills. That becomes part of it because a good pitch involves a connection with a human being.
Absolutely. I mean, connection is again bias, PR. Connection is so important in there. But yes, you know, I almost wish on the sidewalks there was some kind of version of be clear the closing doors, but there isn't. And so you just have to be mindful of it. Although, as I say that, and I live in Michigan, I definitely almost got hit by a bike listening to a podcast walking
Mm-hmm.
because I just wasn't paying attention.
Yeah.
So, that happens.
I hope it was a good podcast.
Derek Thompson. Yeah. So I get really lost in that one sometimes. I'm the person who listens to podcasts at the gym. And so while other people are listening to stuff to pump them up, I am listening to something either ridiculously serious or ridiculously funny.
Me too.
And yeah,
This is my two extremes. I'm either learning or I'm listening to the guys on Smart List. Like that would be a podcast to get on, right? I love them. But people who make me laugh or really who are educating me. I listen to podcasts all the time. I uh,
yeah,
I think they're fantastic. Not just because we're recording one right now, or
no,
because I
yeah.
have one of my own as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say we both have podcasts, and I think you have to be curious, right? If you want to have
Yes.
a conversation with somebody, or you want to take the time, then you have to be curious about other ideas outside of your own. I've never tried to narrow this as much as like yes, we as the Shorty Wars have a brand, but and there's certainly an audience and there's certainly a group that's been built, but I want to expand the barriers of that and get into other things. The one last thing to put a cap on loneliness. My big premise on Cheeseball Man is that was just born out of loneliness. It's randomness too. There's something hilarious about that. Also, quick aside, not the first time somebody has drawn a public crowd. There was the guy in Philadelphia who ate an entire roast chicken,
Right.
which I didn't think that could be beat, but it was beat. So I am usually not a fan of like when something is massively successful, we do the exact same thing. But this was a masterclass in you know what? We all just want to have something we can root for during the middle of the day,
Mm-hmm.
and and be part of a collective experience because we've
Yes.
lost monoculture.
Yes, exactly. No, I agree 100%.
What is the biggest question you get from people who either read this book or are just trying to get advice on pitches?
Question, I don't know about question. I mean, comments. I think one of the things that seems to have really resonated with people in the book is that I have a section on how everything is a pitch and whether or not you want to agree to or you want to agree with that part. And there's another section that I wrote which is goes back to writing, which is about killing your darlings, which is, Stephen King is one of the many. It turns out when I did my research, he wasn't the first person who said that, but that really seems to have resonated with my students. I'm kind of surprised because you know how you never know what's going to really resonate, but that whole idea of, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, is getting it to that point of brevity, that we don't have to hide among a lot of words and numbers. We need to get to what the point is and think about what's most important here that's really going to help to sell this idea. You have to know how an idea is going to work. You have to know the reasons for it, but what's going to connect with whoever, and it goes back to what you said. If you don't know who you're pitching to, that's another, whether it's the brand, what the business is, or it's not that hard to find out about someone anymore either.
It really
All you have to do is do a LinkedIn search, go a little deeper, and if they're really been out there for a while, you can go use ChatGPT, but they're not as current as they need to be, and we still have to vet what they're saying.
I'm
And
pretty
I
sure
say
you can find my
ChatGPT.
So there's a lot of them. As somebody who's been on the internet and used it for growth for over 20 years, like, yeah, there's a lot.
There's a lot of stuff out there. There is something apparently which I haven't used called Delete Me, where you can go find all the stuff that's out there, and it's just I I
I
kind of
like
want to
all my
say,
flaws and all my teens and my 20s out there.
yeah,
I
but
look at it and like I've learned, but as a collective whole, I stand by my work.
yeah, but I kind of remember in like when things really started to take off around 2008, 2009, signing up for so many different platforms, and I don't even know so I don't know where they all are or what happened to them, and so that would be it would be an interesting little archaeological dig.
I wonder if I'm still the mayor of things on Foursquare. Like, you keep that in
Well,
perpetuity.
Foursquare isn't called Foursquare anymore. It's called something else. Swarm. I think it's called Swarm.
um, that period, that period of social media, like '07 to like 11,
Hmm.
is the period I'm like, that would be a different podcast if you want to have me
Hmm.
on and we talk about that, because that is a different, um, that's an era that I think if people didn't live through it or weren't part of their formative years, that they won't fully understand just how the inundation of things that were out there, and the near misses of a lot of different platforms that definitely had something for a moment, but in an era of user acquisition, just couldn't quite get there. But there was a lot of promise and a lot of things that seemed,
Well, it was also a lot of fun. I mean,
yeah,
I mean,
much more
I
fun.
it was definitely more fun. Twitter was my favorite place to be. I haven't been on Twitter or X or whatever he's calling it, since the day Elon Musk took over, because I was disappointed with it already. I thought it might be getting a little bit better, but I don't want to be there anymore. But that was a great, great social network. I mean, it was really what this whole idea was about. But, again, we could go down a whole different path on that. None of us knew, and I put myself right there, had any idea what the dangers might be of an unregulated, and their media platforms, even though they don't want to call themselves that. Yeah, they are.
Well, for legal reasons, I wouldn't want to either. But yes, I know, I completely understand that. For me on Twitter/X, I passively remain, only because I think if you leave something and completely abandon it, you create this power vacuum where then I I could go in a multitude of directions. I could say if we all leave, then it just becomes one just shouting echo chamber
Hmm.
vacuum of nonsense. But if we all leave, then we do lose some of these
No,
communities
I
that,
agree. I agree that. I agree. I could see that, but I wasn't. It doesn't matter. Everything that happens on X gets reposted someplace else anyway.
oh yeah, you can find it.
So it's not even. But
I want to make sure whatever shakeout we're having in the next 2 or 3 years, that we settle on, figure out places for the organizing communities and other communities that have really thrived on Twitter. I'm not so worried about just individual creators. They go everywhere, but it's more so where that community
Mm-hmm.
is.
Yeah, I'm more. I mean, I think the communities be fine. I'm more concerned about having some. We need guardrails. We need some legislation around this, um, not just for the bad actors, for the Russian trolls and people who don't like us, but for people in general. I had a woman on my podcast who wrote a book called Over the Influence, excuse me,
Yeah.
why social media is toxic for women and girls. And it's some of the stuff I knew a lot, but I learned a lot reading that book, and it's a little scary. We do need some legislation. But again, that's not what this. I don't. We're all over the place here, Jeff. My goodness,
It's intentional.
it's intentional. Okay, good. I like this. Is
Because I agree, and I think you have a similar. I've listened. You have a similar philosophy, and like outlines are boring. Let's
mhm.
just figure out what exists in the blank space if we just start talking. You get more natural action
I agree. I
responses.
agree.
I mean, again, there's a book. We have to talk about that. So one of the things I wanted to save to the end, and
Hmm.
I want to run this past you
Okay.
because this is personal for me, and I want to see if I'm right or wrong in how I phrase this. Because one of the things I say a lot with clients is I don't pitch, meaning that and I thought this would be a great way to close because you wrote a book about pitches and everything is a pitch. So I'm going to challenge the notion. Because I probably am going to side with you that yes, everything is pitch. It's just a different adaptation of the pitch, right? I say I
Hmm.
don't pitch because what I'm really saying by that, and I kind of did a dissection of this when I was about to talk to you, is like I don't pitch in the sense that I don't have to find an individual person that I don't know, ask them to do something out of the kindness of their heart, and hope it will happen, which I think is a
Hmm.
lot of the industry. What I'm doing is I'm working with people I've already worked with before, who I have a relationship with, where I have some kind of expectation and they have some
Hmm.
kind of expectation, and I know what's going to happen. So I operate from a point of certainty. But I think your argument would be that's still a pitch.
It's still a pitch. It's still a pitch. But I have a chapter I wrote where I said, yes, I've been selling I never really sold anyone anything, but I learned how to tell a good story.
Correct.
And that's the difference. I use the example, which, I hope not everyone who reads the book is old enough to remember, but that, Alec Baldwin in Glengarry Glen Ross, where he's just like the epitome of this pitch man that you don't want to go near. But it's about learning how to tell a story that engages and using that story format to say this is why whatever I have is something that you want to consider. It's all in how you present it, but we all do pitch. It's just that nasty version of the pitch man, and I say pitch man because that's what they said, even though we have to pitch woman, pitch man. um, so I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's really it's about learning to tell a story, because the
Yeah.
story is what sells. Whether it's a story within a pitch or whether the whole pitch is the story. If I
Right.
use a story as an example to make my point, that's more effective than just saying, "Oh, you have to do this because this says this right here."
Yeah. I honestly, what I thought it was ironic to be having a conversation with someone who wrote a book about pitches, and I make a pitch about myself about not pitching. If you followed along with that, then you followed along with the plot of the
Hmm.
content. But that, again, yes, some of my storytelling is that when I use the word pitch as, not derogatory, but just
No,
I want
there is a lot of derogatory nonsense around it, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. But we still
exactly.
have to use the word pitch for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we have something called SEO. So if you don't put the right words in there, no one's ever going to find you. And
And
that is,
brevity.
and brevity. But those are, they're just, there's certain things that what you just have to accept sometimes.
And I think picking up on the nature of there are connotations with words,
Hmm.
right? And so obviously you can tell a story knowing those connotations, and that's what I have without really thinking about it without really going in depth on it is that's what I picked up on. I really the connotation or the derogatory part of pitch was just that it was friction in my
Mm-hmm.
understanding. That it was
Yes.
mostly, you know, the inconsistency and friction of having to give a pitch. And so if you can eliminate the inconsistency and friction, what can you do with
Mm-hmm.
that time, space, and energy? Joanne, when I close these, I do something called keep it short. They are 3 questions. They are short. Your answers can be however long you want them to be.
Uh-oh.
Are you ready?
I'm I'm holding on. I'm holding on to my desk.
I realize that like my explainer is always longer than the questions. So there's again irony in that statement. Hardest thing you've ever had to pitch?
Oh, I think the hardest thing that I've ever had, I think it's more than one time, but I think it's harder to pitch yourself than it is to pitch anything. I could, and even my book right now. Okay, I'm really good. I could sell anything to anyone. Just give me a little bit of time. I'll figure out how to do it. But with myself and my book, it's like, ooh, I got to really get myself into that spot and have to remind myself of why this is good. So I think it's anything that is really related to me, myself, because then all your own insecurities pop up.
I think that rings true. I think even if people aren't inherently a perfectionist, they're
Mm-hmm.
perfectionists about themselves.
Yeah.
And so that tendency will
Oh,
bear out.
it goes into that imposter syndrome. Oh, did I really? What makes me think that I should be doing this? That kind of nonsense. But then you get out of it because you listen to you talk to yourself.
Yeah, I have to have that conversation daily. Any
Yes.
place or space that I'm in that I've gotten to, I can have a logical conversation of how I got here, and then I can still be like, no, me? Why? Come on, there's better people. Question 2. What holds you back the most?
What holds me back the most?
Yeah.
That's a great question, and I don't even know if I have I know I have no short answer, but you can figure that out already. There are no short answers with me as a rule. I think that goes back. I think it's kind of the same answer. If anything, it's me. It's me sometimes holding myself back of, well, if I say this or if I do this or I think it's myself. But again, I'm old, so I've done a lot of work over the years, so I know what to do and I know what to say to myself to get myself out of that spot. Certainly, that was more true when I was younger than it would be now.
Yeah, we all have a process to kind of get ourselves
Mm-hmm.
the 3 or 4 or 5 things. Any of us who have done therapy, the things that we need to do to kind of get ourselves through and get ourselves there. But yes, I firmly believe that everybody has doubt, whether they express that or not.
Mm-hmm.
There is doubt. Even a person like I am on the opposite end of the perfectionism spectrum. Clearly, I can just kind of walk into a room and go for it.
I can too. I can do that too.
But it's almost like the less I know, the better I am.
Mm-hmm.
The more I know, the more I will overthink it, which may be a lie. I tell myself because I just don't want to do the preparation.
No, it goes back to being comfortable with yourself. And if you're comfortable with yourself, you're going to be okay if you stumble or you fall. Nobody knows this because they weren't at the beginning of the podcast. We had a whole little situation over here with the cameras and this and what have you, and
No, everything was
and everything's fine. But it's it was all me. But I couldn't hear you at that point, but I could see your face laughing because I was having this whole conversation with myself. So you learn how to do that, but it's okay. Now we're here and we're having fun with it and kind of move on.
Well, also just over time, I think we all hopefully take ourselves a little less seriously.
Oh,
I
you
think
have to.
early in my career, I had to do a lot of things because I definitely felt like an imposter to project confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Now I just have confidence and I forget I have it. That's fine. But the confidence is related to. Yeah, I've seen no 1,000 different ways. I've seen things go well. I've seen things. I just, okay, cool. however this goes, I'll give it my best, but however this goes,
Mm-hmm.
I'll move on to the next thing in a split second and hopefully have the attention span of a goldfish, which I do have. Which
Well, you're living in the right century, that's for sure. Everyone, you and everybody else.
I was built for this, but also inherently, when you're built for this, then you can go down so many rabbit holes that you realize it's four. What did I do with my day? So that you have to have some structures in place.
Mm-hmm.
Even the most unstructured person like myself puts structures in place to
Yes.
prevent themselves from being themselves. If that makes sense. Question 3, Joanne, and then we'll run. Smartest question a student ever asked.
The smartest question a student ever asked? Oh, wow, that's a stumper.
I always go for a stumper at the end, and usually it's something like pick your favorite child kind of things, which is it's the same thing.
I don't know. I really, I get a lot of smart questions, but I think in general, and I can't think of a specific right now, but I think in general, they are the ones that they ask about their careers more so than about the subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
What is it going to, how do I, those are the things that sometimes I'm just kind of like, wow, okay, this is part of why I'm here, so I can give you my sage advice. But I can't think of a specific question.
And that's okay. I mean,
And
that's
again, I get a lot. I have a lot of smart. I get a lot of smart questions, and but they're usually around their own career paths, and
well,
those are usually that kind of surprise me and take me back.
I find that smart not knowing the content, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
when I was in school, by the way, and you should always get good grades. That's a disclaimer I'm saying at this, but maybe don't obsess like I did, because I obsessed to the point where I got 1 A- in college and it freaks me out. So I should have had more balance. But the I learned pretty early on that my school wasn't really going to, I think I got to school, got the grades, did everything, thought, okay, I just follow the path, and then somebody hands me the thing. And about halfway through, I realized, oh, that is not going to happen. I'm literally going to have to ask for everything in this life,
Mm-hmm.
and try and position myself and try and I'm operating from multiple points of intersectional privilege, and I'm still sitting there going, ooh boy, I don't know how I'm going to do this no matter what. So when I shifted focus and spent the majority of my time still got the grades, but not caring intently about that, but caring where am I going next and who am I going to know that can help me
Mm-hmm.
get there, that made things a lot easier. So anytime I see those questions asked or get those kinds of questions from people, I feel pretty calm that they're on the right track.
Okay, I like that.
Joanne, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. This has been a delight. My book is right here. I don't know if we're going to do this, and the audio version will be. There will be an audible version, hopefully within the next month.
Ooh, bonus question. Can I ask it?
Yes.
Is Audible reading?
It's so funny that you said that, because again, we're wrapping up the semester. I give all my words of wisdom, and one of which is to read. And I said, and I'm now expanding reading. If you're listening to a book on Audible, I'm counting that as reading. I've also decided that listening to podcasts that are helping you to learn also would count, because I learned so much from the different podcasts that I listen to. So I'll throw that in there. But yeah, I think Audible counts as reading. Some people have trouble reading. They're dyslexic, and that's how they're getting it. So it's all good, as long as you read stuff that doesn't always fit underneath your own little umbrella of what you should be. Open your ears and eyes to other stuff.
Every time I buy a book that will challenge me at the same time. I kind of have to go
Mm-hmm.
back and forth. I have to go with something that's a little easier, a little softer, and then something that's going to absolutely challenge my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm with the belief that consumption and retention of information is essentially what we're going for with reading. How
Mm-hmm.
you get there, I think there are multiple paths. I understand the debate on, well, maybe you can retain it more if you're going at a certain pace with reading, but again, it's learning styles.
It's learning styles. It's all learning styles. So there you go. Jeff, thank you so much.